So, good afternoon, everybody. I do a lot of architects training for Capgemini, and this is one of the very first slides I put up when we start a course of architects. And I'd be really interested if you would shout out what you think the answer to that question is. So, I'm sure I'll hear you. Don't worry about microphones, just shout. So if I gave you that slide and I said to you, what's the role of an architect? What do you think the answer should be? Someone who draws boxes. Can't see that answer up there. Anybody else? Design? Anybody else who's got any ideas? I sometimes think that people are going to say, this one, somebody who sits in an ivory tower, removed from the day-to-day. Nobody else got any views? Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for that. So, well, can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So I'm Liz Ince, and I'm an enterprise architect here at Capgemini.
And I'm Lisa Eckersley, also a principal architect at Capgemini here in the UK. So we're here to talk about JIT, JEA, so Agile architecture, Capgemini's point of view. Go on to the next slide, please, Liz. So architecture is an art form. It's not an exact science. We know this because we have to develop architectures on a case-by-case basis. Different organisations, different solutions, different programmes will need different architectures. It encompasses both technology and people. It provides structure where otherwise there would be chaos. It gives you alignment across teams and other organisations and other programmes within your organisation. It gives you certainty in the world of changing business requirements, as we've seen more than ever in the last 18 months, and avoids unpredictability, gives you reduced risks to allow you to adapt to those business changes. So architecture, we believe, is about engaging with all relevant stakeholders of a programme to manage that complexity, to reduce risk and costs. If you go to the next slide, please, Liz. So what you can see on the screen here is the role of an architect as published by the Capgemini CTIO for Europe, Gunnar Menzel, last year. So there are three core skill sets that an architect needs. They are business skills, software lifecycle, and technology stack. So what do we mean when we say business skills? Well, we have to innovate. We have to be learners. We have to be problem solvers. We have to know and feel comfortable to take calculated risks. We absolutely have to collaborate. That is one of the key skills. And we have to understand our sector. So, for example, this is where it ties in with learning. So, for example, in the last 5 years as my role as an architect, I've worked across logistics, airports, and currently criminal justice. So it's really important I understand the sector. Of course, we need to understand the software lifecycle. So right from the establishing the shared vision and goals with our key clients and stakeholders, right through to design, build, and early life support when we've actually gone live. Go to the next slide, please, Liz. So as well as the different types of skill sets we need as an architect, we have different types of architects. So we have those enterprise architects, looking at that initial shared vision and goals of the organisation with the business stakeholders. They're responsible for taking an initial roadmap of the next 12 to 18, 2 years. We have programme architects that oversee that particular programme of work, looking at the programme-wide roadmap and the actual digital transformation that may need to take place, managing any governance and design authority type processes. And we also have delivery architects. These are the architects that look at design principles and patterns. They have to identify key component-specific requirements. And this is where the technology stack comes into play. So, for example, I'm an integration architect. That's my speciality. So I would have a deeper understanding of API gateways, service buses, etc., than I would do of network, storage, compute. But I still have to have an understanding of all of them. And this is where the delivery architects oversee the entire solution in conjunction with the technical managers, the lead software engineers. So at Capgemini, we do believe that architecture spans the entire software delivery lifecycle, and JIT, JEA, which we'll go into in a bit more detail shortly, enables this more than ever. Next slide. So, architects and software engineers, as I've just said, delivery architects need to work together with those technical managers, those lead software engineers, to jointly drive change and deliver to our clients. So if we were looking at a CRM system, for example, an architect would stereotypically say, why do you need those requirements? What is it you're trying to get your solution to do? And a software engineer may stereotypically say, when do you need it? I know that tool, I know that product, when do you need it? I can do this for you. And what we're saying here is that we need to embrace both those skill sets, empower both the architects and the software engineers to work together, to accept that what we know today might not be applicable tomorrow, be agile, adapt to changes and accommodate those changes, anticipate the change. Don't be worried about making those changes, and again, we'll go into that in some more detail when we go into the JIT, and applying those agile methodologies and tools. So we've set a very high-level overview scene of what architecture and architects and software engineers look like working together, and Liz is just now going to go into a bit more detail about JIT itself.
Thank you, Lisa. So there's a common misconception in the IT industry that architecture must be created top-down, with all architecture-related artifacts created in one go, taking 2 or 3 months, or in some cases even 2 or 3 years. In other words, architecture and agile are just not compatible. So we architects are rumoured to sit in our ivory tower and dictate the architect. It's like Moses going up into the mountain and coming down with the architecture inscribed in tablets of stone. This is now not true. There's been a fundamental change in IT, a fundamental change in the way IT is viewed, in the way it's provisioned, and in the way it is delivered. And every organisation now views IT as a core part of its business. So along with these changes, architecture has also changed. We architects no longer, if we ever did, sit in our ivory tower. It is now about setting a vision with the development team, working with the team to define an architectural approach together. Can we go to the next slide, please, Lisa? So as we are constantly responding to change, we can no longer afford to have an architecture that has taken us years to develop. Architecture has had to become responsive to change in the same way that development has had to become responsive to change. The enterprise architecture team that used to deliver the big design up front is now dead. The adoption of agile development methodologies means that we have to move to adopt agile architecture methodologies. Agile is moving away from long planning and build cycles towards shorter iterations, where we can adjust our priorities at any time and always concentrate on what's most important to deliver today. However, while we are doing that, we need to keep a vision in mind of where we are ultimately heading, so that every iteration, every change, and every release brings us closer to that final business goal. Can we have the next slide, please, Lisa? So an initial reaction is often that architectural design methods and agile software development are incompatible. But agile methodologies recognise that applications need to deliver business outcomes. They need to deliver business value. They have to deliver value for money. They have to deliver the why. So agile development methodologies and architecture need to work hand in hand to deliver that business value. So as the Agile Manifesto recognises, there is a role for architectures. And as it says, the best architectures' requirements and designs emerge from self-organising teams. And if we look at agile methods and frameworks, they either directly address the requirement for an architecture role, or at least they leave room for it. So let's have a look at the relationship between some agile methodologies and architecture. Can we go to the next slide, please? So, although Scrum doesn't specifically identify an architect's role, the architect can be part of the development team, and deciding on architectural issues is always a joint effort between the architect and the team. In disciplined Agile, there is much more emphasis on architecture as a means of helping reduce technical risk through the life of the project. So disciplined Agile has the concept of an architecture owner. And the architecture owner owns the decisions made by the team, facilitates the creation and the evolution of the overall solution, and manages the technical risk of the project. So the architecture owner is responsible for creating the envisioning architecture in the inception phase. And I'll tell you something, you try saying that sentence after 2 gin and tonics when you're doing rehearsal on Saturday night, which is what I did. Did not go well. Okay, so the envisioning architecture is the initial high-level model that helps set the direction at the start of an Agile project. So disciplined Agile also has the concept of proven architecture in the construction phase. So how can you be truly certain that the envisioned architecture will provide a successful solution at the end of the project? You prove it with working code, similar to a spike in XP. And architecture has exactly the same version of if in doubt, code it out, and that helps reduce the technical risk of the project. So SAFE has 3 architecture roles and 3 architecture types. So there is the emerging architecture, which is supported by the systems architect. There is the evolving architecture, which is managed by the solutions architect. And finally, there is the intentional architecture, which is developed by the enterprise architect. So let's have a look at those 3 in a bit more detail. Next slide, please, Lisa. So the emerging architect, so the systems architect works as part of the Scrum team and is responsible for supporting the emerging architecture. And that is the architecture that's coming into existence as a consequence of the development itself. The systems architecture also defines the team boundaries or guardrails. So these guardrails provide the limits in which the development team can take architectural decisions themselves. The whole point of having the guardrails is to ensure that all the Scrum teams move together in the same direction and fulfill the strategic goals of the project. The evolving architecture is managed by the solution architect, and it's a project-wide view across all the Scrum teams involved in that particular project. The evolving architecture checks that the software currently being developed will all work together, and it also defines how the deployments should be synchronized. So the solution architect also needs to check that the emerging architecture supports the long-term vision of the project. And then finally, the intentional architecture. This is the long-term strategic vision developed by the enterprise architect. And the intentional architecture is there to steer all the development teams and all the projects in the same strategic direction towards the company's business goals. The next slide, please, Lisa. So that was a whistle-stop tour of some of the Agile methodologies. And as I said, they either have a role for an architect, or at least they allow room for an architect's role within their methodologies. However, that role is very different to the old-style architect's role. And if organizations are going to be successful in the future, architects not only need to adopt Agile, but they need to positively embrace it. So Lisa talked about the why of development. And JIT is very much concerned with the why of development, and it also supports the what of development that the developers are really interested in. So Capgemini's just-in-time, just-enough architecture is all about embracing Agile architecture. It is based on SAFE, but it adds the just-in-time and just-enough approach. So that's applying architecture principles to development when needed, but not too much to overburden the development teams. So the development teams have just enough architecture for the specific task in hand. And it's about the architects and development teams working together to provide the why and the what of development. So there are 5 main points, as it says on the slide there. Just enough architecture, just enough documentation, just enough governance, delivered just in time and in iteration-sized chunks. Can we go on to the next slide, please, Lisa? So architecture in the context of JIT is about designing the right solution, but a flexible right solution. This is all about the why of development. It provides the vision, the intentional architecture that allows teams to understand where they fit in the overall program and the direction that that program is moving in. It provides the guardrails, allowing teams to make their own decisions within some set boundaries. I always think of JIT as being the central reservation barrier in the motorway of development. It's there to prevent a simple mishap becoming a full-blown disaster. So if you stray off the path a bit, it gently guides you back in again, rather than crashing off and careering into the development team that's on the other side of the motorway. So JIT also helps foster a common understanding between teams, supporting an ongoing dialogue so that everybody understands the interoperability between those services that are being developed. And then finally, it's about giving guidance on generic services and tooling so that they are common across all teams. Next slide, please, Lisa. So when is enough architecture enough? And as with all these things, of course, it is not a one-size-fits-all approach. So what is just enough architecture depends on several things: the objective of the initiative, the amount of technical risk, and I guess the appetite of the company for technical risk, and then also the culture of the company. The maturity of the development team is also a factor. The more experienced and knowledgeable the team is, the more can be left for them to decide for themselves. Within certain boundaries, those are the guardrails. The greater the technical risk, the more upfront research and architecture that will be required to help minimise the risk. And of course, architectural spikes can be used to help confirm things that are going to be really difficult to change later on, like languages, tool sets, frameworks, and patterns. The Agile principle of when in doubt, code it out, as I have also said, is just as applicable to architecture as it is to coding. A highly agile team in a non-agile company will not fit well. Fixed price contracts, fixed scope, and also fixed delivery dates will require much more upfront design and architecture just to be able to understand the amount of work that's going to be required to fulfill that project. So a JIT architecture is delivered incrementally, starting with an initial blueprint to support a walking skeleton. Then the architecture is delivered continuously, following the directions set by the intentional architecture, and then reconciling it with the emerging architecture in each iteration as the project progresses. Key to all of this is continual feedback. Everyone in the project learns together as the development progresses. As the project progresses, it may be necessary to refine the intentional architecture, and JIT always recommends a design sprint to do that, and everybody has to be involved. The architectures, the DevOps teams, and of course the product owners, they all need to get together to scope any changes that are needed. Can we go to the next slide, please? So if an organisation is going to invest in a massive new IT infrastructure that will require development over many years, you can bet your bottom dollar that there will be either a change to the requirements or a change to the technology. So how do you get these changes into the emergent architecture? So the architectural runway provides a way of introducing such changes into the emergent architecture during the life of a long project. And the aim of an architectural runway is to reduce rework and also to reduce technical debt. So I think the metaphor of a runway works really well here. You can see the aeroplane approaching from a long distance away. The pilot and the people in the control tower have plenty of time to exchange information. What's the condition of the runway? What's the prevailing weather conditions? So the pilot has got plenty of time to make the optimal approach to the runway for the prevailing conditions. The pilot makes a safe landing. The plane is then absorbed into the smooth running of the airport. There are 4 categories of epics that sit on the architectural runway. The first one is exploration enablers. So these support prototyping in case you need to refine the business or the customer's needs. There are architectural enablers, guidelines, features, and stories, and these actually go to construct the architectural runway. Then there are infrastructural enablers. Now, these are the new technology changes that come along that can help further either enhance or automate the development, test, or deployment environments. And then finally, our favourite friends, the compliance enablers. We have all those lovely requirements, don't we? GDPR, security, and of course there are always plenty of industry-specific regulatory requirements that we have to be cognizant of. So Lisa, over to you.
Yeah, I'm sorry, an architect is going to talk about documentation. But it's important to have just enough documentation. There is clearly a balance between documenting absolutely everything and having nothing at all. So it's key to remember the audience of the documentation. So during a sprint or a series of sprints, your audience might be the test team, DevOps, network teams, etc., so that they understand what's coming. They know what solutions are on the way. It's what is useful. It's just enough documentation, what is useful. We don't want to have comprehensive, write down absolutely everything you know, because it will be a case of too long didn't read. Conversely, we don't want to write nothing because then people will think, well, there's nothing in there, I'm also not going to read that either. So there is always a balance. We need to understand what builds are taking place in that evolving architecture to inform the intentional architecture. So as I say, you need to remember the audience. During a project, it will be testers, it will be DevOps. At the end of a project, it would be the BAU support teams. So when we've all built our absolutely fantastic solutions and have long gone to build other fantastic solutions for other clients, heaven forbid there will be a defect. The support teams need to understand what it is the system is about and what it is that needs to be fixed. Okay, the next slide, please, Liz. So governance. So again, governance is something architects always talk about. And again, to try and remove that ivory tower myth, this is not about marking anyone's work. It's not about checking up on people. It's just making sure that we are continually aligning our solution to the requirements effectively, getting those business changes, getting the feedback from the software engineers, from the testers about any limitations that we're finding on the products, any change in requirements that are going to impact on those. So how do we do this effectively? Well, we all have to be in the teams. We do something known as the Gemba Walk. I'm not going to actually do a Gemba Walk, whatever that is, but it's about leading and guiding and controlling those teams to gain mutual respect for each other, embrace each other's skill sets. During COVID, obviously, this has been made harder because we can't actually physically sit with each other. But where I'm working currently, for example, we sit and we do refinement, we write stories, we ask why a story's being written in a certain way. And it's all just part of that ensuring governance, ensuring we're getting an effective solution to meet the requirements. Let's go to the next slide, please, Liz. So just to summarise, just-in-time architecting. So we don't want to spend time architecting some non-functional requirements that we know we're going to be doing a spike or building a prototype for in the next sprint or two. That's not necessary. So focus on the bits of architecture that are important to inform the next significant phase. Just-in-time documentation, understand what the needs of the audience are, the stakeholders that are actually going to read this. And just-in-time governance. So remember, what is the last possible moment that you need to take a decision, whether that's swapping a product out or whatever that is. You just need to understand that last possible moment to take a decision. And as Liz said as well, all this has to be done in iteration-sized chunks. So the needs for one team in one sprint to help that emerging architecture, program plans for a set of sprints for the evolving architecture, and the blueprints for the next 6 to 12 months for the intentional architecture. Yes, next slide. So we're just going to have a little look at about how that might work in practice. We've got a couple of case studies to walk through. And first, I'm going to talk about my current engagement. So I'm currently working for Her Majesty's Courts and Tribunal Service, which is part of the Ministry of Justice. It's by no means a perfect example of JIT-JEA, but it's a really good example of JIT-JEA working. So what is HMCTS? It's a programme. The crime programme is part of a £330 billion digital transformation programme called Reform, which is currently the largest programme in UK government. And crime is part of that. And it's a once-in-a-generation digital transformation of the criminal justice service. We have 200 people on the programme. We have 30 business and technical architects and 10 sprint teams. We're a CQRS-based framework with upwards of 37 contexts, each with at least one microservice, using REST-based APIs and hosted on Azure. We will cater for 25 million messages across both the magistrates and Crown Courts, and we'll be integrating with 43 police forces, 1,500 non-police prosecutors, and several partner agencies such as the Crown Prosecution Service, the DVLA, and the Legal Aid Authority. And what we're trying to do is take 150-year-old laws and transform them into new technology. It's a highly complex programme, and it's absolutely critical because people's lives actually depend on it. So how does that tie into JIT-JEA? Well, we have an intentional architecture which has passed down from the Reform programme. So we have the Reform vision, which the crime programme has the flexibility, for the crime programme to adapt to that. We have technical architects within our teams. So we employ OODA loops, which is Observe, Orient, Decide, Act. And we have KPIs that inform the architecture as we go things such as network consumption, API consumption or network usage. We have a software engineer and a technical architect in each of the sprint teams, and they inform each of the other sprint teams, and we have an overarching set of software engineers and architects that also feed into other reform program sprint teams. So, for example, we had a change in business requirements, which meant that we had to change our API management gateway. So the crime program did the technical spike on that, and other reform programs took the learnings from that. So there was no duplication of effort and saving taxpayer money, which is always a good thing. So when we first tried to work in a sort of a JIT JEA way of working, it was tricky. We are, like I say, 200 people on the program. We're a mixture of civil servants, software integrators, independent contractors, a whole plethora of people, all with different cultures, different mindsets coming from different organisations. So what we had to do was we had to start really strict. We had to spend 6 months employing really strict governance processes. And if you just go to the next slide, please, Liz. And it took about a year. We learnt the hard way, but we have broken down those barriers now. We've all got the same cultural mindset. We have the architect and the lead software engineer in the sprint teams jointly producing low-level designs, jointly responsible for those, sharing their show and tells together, so it's a shared ownership of a particular working piece of code. And at the end of each of the design authority sessions, we do actually check in with the software engineer that they haven't been coerced into the architect's ivory tower in any way, just to make sure that we are still all trying to employ the same track. So where are we now? So that took about 6 months, and for the last couple of years we've been working really well in this way. We have releases every 2 weeks. We are going live with a police force and a court every month. And in the spirit of if you build it, they will come, we have several other government agencies coming to the crime programme wanting to integrate with us because they can just see how well it's working and what we've got to offer. And again, avoiding that duplication across government agencies, saving the taxpayer money, which is always a good thing. When we're fully live next year, as you can see there, the Common Platform will provide a collaborative end-to-end digital platform for all magistrates and Crown courts, reducing duplication and saving the judiciary and the court staff money. Again, always a good thing. Thank you.
So earlier this year, I carried out a review for a large home delivery organisation, which is sort of a bit of a case study on how not to do it, which in my case is why there's no names and no pat drill up here. So I looked at their IT infrastructure, and it became clear there had been a history of build and not buy. And not that there's anything wrong in a case of build and not buy, although why anybody wants to write your own payroll solution is beyond me, but there we go. Because there was no architecture function inside the organisation providing that long-term view and that long-term roadmap, every development team had been able to choose whatever tool set they wanted and go off in whichever direction that they wanted, with the result that there was a plethora of tool sets, and that made it really difficult for people to move between teams and between projects. There was little or no documentation, and that combined with the wide variety of tool sets that were there in existence made maintenance of the systems really difficult. And of course, there were a huge amount of systems because they'd all been built from scratch. So some of the older systems had also been built using tool sets and languages that were no longer fashionable. And so trying to get a subject matter expert to work on some of these was really, really difficult. So the overall result was a siloed set of IT solutions that were difficult to share data across. Many of them were out of date and, of course, no longer meeting business requirements because it was so difficult to maintain them. So how would adopting JIT JEA in this type of organisation have helped? Well, for the first thing it would have done, it would have provided that long-term vision, that intentional architecture and that long-term strategic goal and direction. The provision of documentation, a central single view of the documentation that would have supported maintenance. And if that documentation had been version controlled, then you could see what would have happened to the software during the life cycle of the programs. And then, of course, defining a common set of tooling and a common set of approaches would have not only supported maintenance, but it would have allowed developers to move between projects and teams so that not everybody was stuck doing maintenance. Everybody had a go at doing something new and something that was exciting rather than just keeping some of the older systems going. Can we go to the next slide, please, Lisa? So we've now walked you through our view of Agile architecture and how it relates to Agile development. We've also looked at some of the principles behind JIT-JEA. And of course, you would not be surprised, we've produced our own Agile manifesto, slightly different, but that is ours for JIT-JEA. There are 5 specific principles that I want to leave you with. The first one is that Agile architects will ensure alignment between the intentional architecture and the emerging architecture from the development teams. Agile architects will identify and support prioritization of architectural topics in the product backlog. That's based on input and feedback loops from the Agile development teams. Agile architects bring their experience to coach, advise, and technically support the Agile teams. And that will be based on real product, not just using documents as a way of communicating. Agile architects will clearly understand Agile development practices. They will regularly communicate with the development teams, and they will participate in Agile ceremonies. And finally, Agile architects will respect experienced professionals in the development teams, and they will listen carefully to their suggestions. Lisa, over to you, please.
Thank you. So how are you going to train your architect? You need to keep your architect out of that ivory tower. We're not on projects just to make ourselves feel good. We want our designs to be looked at, reviewed, read, listened to, same as everybody else. Otherwise, frankly, going to work every day is soul-destroying, in the same way as if you wrote a piece of code and deployed a capability and no one used it. Equally soul-destroying. It's exactly the same. So how we would do that is pretty much what I explained in my case study, really. It's that shared ownership of designs, co-presenting those show and tells, embracing each other's skill sets, constantly having that feedback loop. As I mentioned earlier, I'm an integration architect, and it's always communication that gets good solutions, not always the technology. So if we're an empowered team, we reduce our risks and costs, we have a happier working life and happier clients, which ultimately is what it's all about. So, to summarise, culture and mindset are the biggest obstacles, as I mentioned. It took us 6 months to a year to get my current engagement aligned on that. We have to balance the skills of the team. If this isn't your organisation's usual way of working, then start strict and then relax back those processes once everyone's on board. And if we have the same cultural mindset, a shared visibility of the dependencies, a shared vision, then it will make for a productive and happy team. And after all any of us ever want is to be loved. Thank you. So we have a few minutes for questions, if anyone has any.
So I'm okay with the running project. The things concept you said is okay, but when it comes to scratch or something we're starting from the base level, the just-in-time architecture or something very basic thing, is that enough? Do you really feel that's enough? Because we are planning to go for something like 10 years or something. So when we have to put the basement right, so I feel like that.
So you would probably be able to at least have something for the next 6 to 12 months, that blueprint that we mentioned earlier. So you would know, for example, you would need an API gateway. You know you want to be cloud-based or not. So you would still be able to have a blueprint of what your intentional architecture looked like if you're starting from scratch, whether it's preferred partners or preferred languages, preferred principles, whatever your goal is, you will be able to put in a blueprint for your intentional architecture. Do you have anything to add on that, Liz?
No, I mean, a lot of it will depend on the company culture as well. So if you always have a buy, not build, then it's much easier because you're going to end up buying a lot of SaaS solutions. So it limits what you can actually put in your intentional architecture because of what's being dictated down from very senior levels within the organisation. That's one thing that I quite often find when I look at organisations. They'll have a business strategy about how they acquire their IT, which will automatically limit down the amount of choice that you have.
If a big team is coming up, then we have to do something big with it. The EAC, there's resources, we are just coming up, putting up like 25 or 30 resources inside, and we just have to plan and we have to give it to them. So okay, you start here, so someone have to plan there. So these guys go here. So we have to put the big picture rather than.
Yeah, so that's when you talk to the organisation you're working with, find out what their actual vision is, find out what their goals are, and as Liz said, about what is their general strategy for their IT. Fundamentally, you need to know if they're a buy or build, for example. Yeah.
What's the future of architects?
This is the future of it. We have a role. We absolutely have a role. It's all about those guardrails that Liz mentioned.
So what will be there are the real architects? Will they be there?
Controversial. Yeah, so I think, as Liz said, there is a space for architecture. There absolutely is, because we all have different skill sets that complement each other. It's the when, the why, and the what. They all complement each other to make a cohesive solution. Yeah.
How much development should architects do based on your 3 categories?
Depends who you're asking. If it's me, probably not much.
If it's me, it's none either. I mean, that's why we have it's not the solution architect, the systems architects, and that's why we have senior systems engineers.
So I started my career in IT on a support team. Then I was a developer, did a bit of testing, and then kind of almost fell into architecture, if you like. So I think it's always good for everybody to have experienced some level of development and absolutely some level of testing, in my opinion. But yeah, I wouldn't expect necessarily the architects to be coding, but who knows? If you're a small team, then maybe you have to. Again, it's a case-by-case basis.
You get a framework knowledge without developing that. That means like frameworks keep on coming, like introducing Spring Boot and other things, introducing some other stuff, and there's something keep on coming. So without developing it, how do you know what is there, what is good fit for this thing?
So at the start, I said about we have lots of business skills. So one of those was learning. So we absolutely we go on we go on training courses. To understand the product set we're doing. We've got, for example, I'm a MuleSoft certified architect, but doesn't necessarily mean I know how to develop a MuleSoft, but I know its capabilities, and I have a bunch of MuleSoft developers I can call on, for example.
So how do you almost rely on those engineers and their feedback?
Yeah, it's the feedback loop. They're the ones with the product low-level detail, and they feedback to say, actually, this design might not fit because the product actually has this limitation, and it's this constant feedback loop. Oh, sorry, in the darkness. Oh.
So adopting JIT, did you say it requires a universal adoption across the whole organisation? Or could it be in, say, a large organisation with a hierarchical architecture group, that only one group could adopt it and then interface with the larger teams, or would it be universal?
I think it could be either. As I said earlier, sorry, Liz. Earlier, we adhere to the wider reform kind of architectural vision, but we have that flexibility on crime to kind of forge our own way, but taking guidance from that wider architecture. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I think it's very difficult. I mean, a lot of it is company culture, and sometimes you're battling against the company culture if you want to work in an agile way. It's a lot of it, I find, is down to the attitude of an organisation and how much you can get them to change.
Yeah.
Not an easy question, unfortunately. The answer's not easy either.
No, you may need to start small and show that it works, and then go wider. Or it's.
Any last questions?
Why do you think the company culture is so hard to change? Because of fear?
Yes, usually.
Yeah.
People like what they know, even if they don't think it's the right thing to do, generally. So it's the fear of the unknown. Maybe in some respects it's a fear of losing their kind of area of expertise or something. I think it's really important to say it's about embracing skill sets. It's not about taking anything away from either party. As I said before, no one wants to produce anything that no one looks at, reads, views, because that is just soul destroying. Nobody wants that. So yeah, I personally think it is fear of change. Humans are creatures of habit.
I've got a question that's been typed in here. Is it different for Capgemini coming into a project, in for project-based work and trying to do this as part of an organisation? Most places I've been have self-empowered teams, which usually means they can do whatever they feel because that's agile. Very difficult to get roadmaps, etc., created even preliminarily. Gosh, it's almost as if I'd had gin and I haven't had time yet. again, my personal experience is if there is no form of any overarching vision, then everybody just goes off and does what they want. And it's really difficult to try and understand what has been done, then how do you maintain it. There's a couple of situations where they developed a software product that was very agile, built in a very agile way, and then the development team got fed up with what they were doing and they all went off. And then what happens when you need to change that in 4 or 5 years' time? And nothing stays the same. You then get left with an application that nobody has any documentation from, none of the team is there that can support it, and then you have a real issue. And I've been in some situations where what we've actually turned around and said, I'm afraid you're almost going to have to throw it away and start again. And it's a really difficult, I don't know what your experience is, Lisa, but it's a really difficult balance, because you need to get everybody enough freedom to get on with doing the job properly. And the last thing I want to do is dictate to anybody how you should do the development. But I do need to then go back and say to the business, well, this is what it looks like. This is how you're going to support it in the future, so that when somebody has a problem and they ring up the help desk, somebody knows what to do with it. And it's all about trying to strike that right balance.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And sometimes it's actually as fundamental as contractual. What have you actually been contracted to do as an architecture team or as a Capgemini team? Because I think it mentioned a Capgemini team there. So, yeah. It can be as fundamental as what is in the contract, unfortunately, and we need to help shape and guide those contracts as well.
It's not a question. It's like the last session I attended is domain-driven section, so they just emphasize the initial design is very much important. It's kind of, this session is kind of going against that, so that's what I'm just confused. How about the domain-driven design comes in Europe?
HMCTS is domain-driven design, so it does work. I'm spying the DDD person in the corner over there. Yeah.
How do you stop yourself like over-architecting things that don't need to be like over-engineered? It's quite easy to get carried away with adding new microservices, but one day you don't really need it. How do you deal with that in a JIT situation?
Yeah, I guess you have to just you have to understand the roadmap, have to understand what increments are coming, have to understand reuse. I guess it's kind of as simple as that. We're all aware. We have sort of principles in place, reuse principles, for example, and we've got a playbook. So we kind of have that 12-month view. We've split up the increments into certain types of features, so we kind of grouping them sensibly, if you like, so you kind of get a feel for that. I mean, there's always a risk, of course, and that's why that constant feedback loop comes from, engaging with the requirements, engaging with all the stakeholders.
How do you identify when it's going in the wrong direction? Developer satisfaction?
If the architecture's going in the wrong direction?
Yeah.
I think, how do you gauge if the architecture's going in the wrong direction? So I guess you get a feel for it. I guess because you're getting constant feedback, I guess, based on usage as well. If you've got anything that's just kind of sitting there doing nothing, you can't. It's difficult to over-architect, I think, if you're doing it in a just-in-time way. I think it's more likely to do that if you're doing business design, big design up front. Well, I've got another question on the thing, or
I think it was just a response to the earlier one. Yeah.
Fair enough.
So I think we've got
There's
time for
another
one more
yeah.
question.
Sounds like, so you did mention how in the beginning sometimes you will allow for the ability for new requirements to come in and change the architecture and then be developed. How do you centralize communication about this type of change to the particular architecture group and not just have it happen without your surveillance? How do you centralize communication about changing the architecture in the beginning phases when things are happening so quickly?
Yeah, where I'm currently, HMCTS, for example, we have weekly design authority sessions that there's a key attendee from each of the areas, so architect, software engineer, testers, BAU. We also have, obviously, the standard scrum of scrums, and there's just, it's all about feedback. It's fundamentally, all of this is about communication. So we do have those sessions weekly. We have design sessions weekly, which are kind of the equivalent, if you like, of the architecture design authority, where the architects sit in on all the design team's feedback, look at plans, look at playbook, look at defects that are coming out, and it's a constant. We have 2 or 3 sort of sessions every week where it's a constant feedback loop. Any more?
Okay.
No.
In that case, I think for us it's beer o'clock. Thank you
Thank you very
much.
much.